Now, one of the striking features about both supporters of the Brexit referendum and Trump's campaign was this support amongst what I'm calling the white working class, the older white working class. And this fact has led to much commentary and discussion about whether this support for right-wing nationalism and populism was rooted in economic or in cultural developments. And you probably, if you've been following the news, seen some of this discussion. On the one hand, some interpret support for right-wing populism as a rejection of multiculturalism and identity politics. And this is the English nationalist group, the English Defence League, and they're protesting refugees here. This view sees populism as being driven by latent racism and a backlash against the rising social position of racialized and sexualized minorities and of women. Other analysts emphasize the degree to which support for populism is linked with economic distress and insecurity. And this was put out by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. It shows that cities, especially in the north of England, that are most distressed economically, voted overwhelmingly to leave. In this case, in the case of Brexit, some of the privileged evidence that these levers were driven. Sorry, I've completely lost my point. Let me move on. So you have two sides. Is it economic insecurity? People are suffering in the economy, or is it a cultural backlash driven by racism and sexism? I think that asking whether economic or cultural developments were, which was more important, the outcomes is actually the wrong question. And here's my argument. There are good reasons for believing that economic and cultural developments have operated together to support populism. I'm not just saying that both are active. I'm saying that, in fact, they combine. The more important question is not whether populism is driven by either economic or cultural factors, but rather how economic and cultural forces might combine in an integrated rather than just an additive way. That is to say, there's a feedback between the two. Economic and cultural developments have combined to depress how white working class, and especially white working class men, perceive their own social status. And this is the key point, I think. Since social status is typically conferred by both levels of income and the quality of one's occupation, shifting patterns of employment that have eliminated well-paying, medium-skilled jobs and forced many men and women into more precarious positions have undercut their own sense of where they stand in society. At the same time, shifts in cultural frameworks marked by an increasing emphasis in mainstream discourse on racial and gender equality have threatened the subjective social status of any who have relied on the notion that they were white or male to underpin their own sense of social standing. It's not just that economic and cultural developments are happening independently of each other. I think there's an interactive connection here. For instance, the movement towards a knowledge economy has increased the demand for highly skilled workers and the wage premium to college degrees, putting people without such a degree at an economic disadvantage. But as more people acquire such education, the social esteem accorded to those that lack it falls further. In this case, a particular set of economic developments sets in motion changes in cultural frameworks that multiply the effects. And there's a bunch of studies that have tried to get at some of these issues. I'm just going to give you one example. There's one very big study being operated out of Harvard tries to measure social status over time in a variety of Western democracies. It's been going on since the 1980s. And it includes the use of the International Social Survey Program. And this slide here is that boils down some of the findings. As part of this study, respondents were asked to place themselves on a social ladder reflecting whether they were closer to the top or bottom of society. In almost every country in the sample, men without a college education reported lower levels of relative social status in 2014 than they did 2 or 3 decades before. These declines were modest, but remarkably consistent. So basically what this graph is trying to show us is that they measured where people saw themselves in society, where they saw their social status in society, and the black line is where it is in the early parts, in the early 1990s mostly, and the grey line is where they see themselves in 2014. And in almost all cases, the big exception that needs explanation I don't have for you is Hungary. But in most cases, there is this decline. same people, people of the same class, feeling that their social status is declining over time. Now, historians and social scientists have known for decades that people care about social status as much as they care about income levels. Thus, working class voters who feel that their social status is eroding may well turn against the mainstream parties who have presided over that decline. And they may well be inclined towards candidates who promise to restore that status, as many of the populist right do. And I'm going to give you an example from Donald Trump here. Donald Trump, whether he knew it or not, and I suspect he didn't, but he appealed directly to such concerns in his speeches when he was stumping on the campaign. Quote, "While my opponent slanders you as deplorable and irredeemable, I call you hard-working American patriots who love your country and want a better future for all your people. You are mothers and fathers and soldiers, sailors and carpenters and welders." He didn't say it as well as I'm saying, by the way. "You are Americans and you are entitled to leadership that honors you, cherishes you, and defends you. Every American is entitled to be treated with dignity and respect in our country."
That was a lovely reading from a teleprompter.
Yes, yes.
That is not his true feelings.
I agree. But someone is smart enough in his campaign to realize that that is where the disenchantment is. Across developed democracies, lower level of subjective social status are strongly associated with voting for right-wing populist parties. This plays out historically too. If you look at what happened in the 1930s, you can find, and 20s, you can find the same pattern. People who express lower levels of social status and the feelings that their relative social standing is getting worse also express higher levels of political alienation, often reflected in the belief that one has to be corrupt in order to succeed in life. Further, scholarly studies in both the US and European contexts have found that supporters of populist figures don't necessarily resent those wealthier than themselves. It's not just about money. They do resent being told what to do and what to think by people with education that they themselves don't have. And they resent people who think they are getting benefits from social programs to which they think they are not entitled. And this usually means immigrants. Now I'm going to flesh out this argument and make sense of it by using Brexit. Back to Mr. Farage. As I noted earlier, there's been a significant Eurosceptic constituency in Britain from the get-go. It's not like suddenly it happened. There have been people in Britain right from the 1960s onwards that didn't want to be part of the European Union. But by the 1990s, that was a very small minority. And even in politics, Euroscepticism had basically declined as a position. There was a peak under Thatcher, because Thatcher became a Eurosceptic. But by the 1990s, that Euroscepticism was in decline. It was on the margins. By the time Tony Blair won his landslide victory in 1997, it appeared as if Britain had finally embraced a firmly pro-European future. Yet within a decade, that Euroscepticism would be rising again. And it found a new champion and home, the new populist movement, the UK, United Kingdom Independence Party, or UKIP. And that's the Nigel Farage, the leader of it from 1997. Significantly, Blair's Labour government was more open to immigration than had been Mrs. Thatcher's Tories. And when the EU expanded to form the former communist states of the East, particularly Poland and the Baltic states, in 2004, Britain and Ireland alone amongst the EU put no limitations on the number of people who could move to Britain. So other European countries, including Germany, put a cap on the number of people who could work in their countries from Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, etc. But Britain and Ireland didn't. It was expected at the time that maybe 15,000 of these new EU residents would move to the UK every year. In actuality, between 2004 and 2008, 1.5 million. Now, because the UK's overall economy was doing well in these years, growing anxieties about immigration increasingly expressed outside of London were largely dismissed by the government. UKIP, however, increasingly drew on this resentment. UKIP got much positive press from the right-wing tabloid media in Britain, which is quite strong, led by moguls like Richard Desmond and Rupert Murdoch of the Fox Empire. And the influx of Eastern Europeans after 2004 agitated the UKIP base and led to a slow but steady rise in electoral support for UKIP. And this led to concerns amongst the Conservative Party, because UKIP was on the right, Conservatives were on the right politically, And many conservatives in the right of the party feared that UKIP was going to take away their voters. Even though UKIP only ever elected one MP to Westminster, it was feared that the Tories would lose many of their core supporters to UKIP. And then in 2008, we have the financial crisis, which engulfed Europe, started in America, of course, but engulfed Europe and resulted in massive problems in the Eurozone. That's the area of Europe that uses the euro. Britain doesn't. But Britain suffered anyway. Britain and its financial markets were so interconnected with the global financial markets that there was a crash in Britain as well. And the government responded with austerity measures. And to the anger of many average Britons who felt the sting of the crisis, Britain did little, just as the US did little, to penalise British bankers whose reckless business practices had helped to precipitate the crisis. And there was a number of large banking failures in Britain. Moreover, now the influx of Eastern European workers, mostly semi or unskilled, were perceived to be a bigger problem than they had been just a few years earlier. And in a throwback to the beginning of the 20th century and the 1905 Aliens Act, 1905 was the first time that Britain imposed a limitation on immigration to Britain in its history on the basis of ethnicity. And this was to stop European Jews fleeing pogroms in Poland and Russia from going to London. There was a marked backlash against immigrants in Britain, not on the basis of colour necessarily, but the basis of origin. And Poles in particular faced a lot of animosity from this time forward. The immigrants from Eastern Europe were blamed for depressing the labour market, for pushing down wages, and for not fitting in, quote unquote, with British society. I know this is unpleasant, but this kind of thing has got to be quite prevalent. Resentment towards the new immigrants was matched by resentment towards the political parties that had permitted this to occur. So the financial crisis, along with the clear unpopularity of Britain's participation in the Iraq War, which is also been going on this time, led to the collapse in the fortunes of the Labour Party and the election of a conservative Liberal Democrat coalition led by Tweedledum and Tweedledee here, David Cameron and Nick Clegg. Now, Cameron, who was Prime Minister, was a supporter of the EU, and so was Clegg. In fact, the Liberal Democrats have always been the most vocally EU-positive party. But Cameron became aware of growing anger and disillusionment within his own party over EU membership. And I can talk about this in great detail, but I won't at this point. If you want to know more about it in questions, I'm happy to. But essentially, he, in an effort to quell dissent within his own party, he agreed to announce a referendum on EU membership for 2016. This was announced in February of 2016, and the poll was to happen on June 23rd, 2016. And this announcement immediately led to the creation of Leave and Remain campaigns. Cameron, much of the Conservative Party, and most of the opposition Labour Party all backed the Britain in Stronger campaign, the official Remain group. But a handful of high-profile Tory MPs organised the official Leave campaign. The Justice Secretary, Michael Gove, and the former London Mayor, you might have seen him at the Olympics, Boris Johnson, became the de facto leaders of the official Vote Leave campaign. Just as an aside here, both Gove and Johnson are clearly opportunists. I don't think either of them really cared one way or the other. They're not principled Brexiteers. Both of them were looking for more profile within their own party, and certainly in the case of Johnson's case, but probably in the case of Gove's case as well, they were looking to become the next leader of the party. Neither of them thought that the Leave campaign would win. Johnson's shocked response to the referendum result demonstrated he had no plan, no clue really about what to do once the vote actually went to the Leave way. Meanwhile, a separate campaign was organised by Nigel Farage, and this was called Leave.eu, and this was organised by UKIP, and was the more populist of the two campaigns. A small number of Labour MPs joined these Leave groups, and had he not been Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn would probably have done so too. Corbyn was a Eurosceptic, had always been a Eurosceptic, had voted against joining the EEC back in 1975, had voted against the EU on every opportunity he had a chance to vote. And in fact, on the day of the referendum, he refused to acknowledge which way he had voted. There's a long history of Labour Euroscepticism. I can talk about that too if you're interested. The Remain campaign was somewhat hamstrung by the fact that one of its main leaders was very ambivalent about it. He made speeches in favour of remaining, but there was always a sense that he didn't really believe what he was saying. The Remain campaign was criticised before the vote and afterwards for not connecting with the population. This is a fair criticism, particularly in rural and economically depressed areas. Not only did Remainers fail to adequately explain in emotionally as well as intellectually satisfying ways why membership benefited Britain, they relied on the authority of experts to make their case, and this was a mistake. They relied on people like me. And usually on the case for the economic consequences of leaving rather than on the benefits of staying. Partly, this was because the leaders of the Remain campaign, and most significantly Cameron himself, started out completely complacent about the results. They thought they were going to win. They did not think there was any chance that people would vote to leave. It was only when, towards the end of the campaign, when the polls indicated the vote was too close to call, did Remain ramp up its rhetoric and emotion, but then only in a very negative manner. And George Osborne, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Finance Minister at the time, and he basically said that he used scare tactics to the effect of, if we leave the EU, I'll have to do an austerity budget that will dwarf the austerity budgets that we've already been living through, and everyone's life will be miserable. This was not a way to win hearts and minds. In contrast to the Remain campaign, the Leave campaign played unapologetically on emotional responses from the very start. It played on nostalgia, on this mythologized British past, pre-EU glories, on anger, with UKIP in particular blaming Westminster for years of austerity and for the economic disadvantage while the rich prospered, on resentment towards the political and intellectual elites for their anti-democratic condescension towards the masses, on hope for a different future, and increasingly, especially as the campaign wore on fear, and in particular fear of outsiders. That the Leave campaign concentrated on appealing to this variety of emotions was entirely calculated. During the campaign, Michael Gove famously dismissed the well-sourced factual objections to Leave promises with the statement, quote, "The British people have had enough of experts." And the co-founder of the Leave campaign and the financial backer of UKIP, the multi-millionaire of dubious background, Aaron Banks, he said immediately after the vote, quote, "Facts don't work for winning votes. The Remain campaign featured fact. It just doesn't work. You have to go and connect with people emotionally. It's the Trump success," unquote. That was 5 months before Trump won the election. You may not be surprised that there's now all sorts of investigations of Mr. Banks and UKIP for campaign finance reform, for being funded by the Russians, for possible connections to the US campaign, etc., etc., etc. It's important to remember that this debate played out against the backdrop of general discontent with the British government for austerity, the austerity era, and its attitude towards the electorate that had arguably been growing for decades, and certainly since 2008. Economic inequality has been a growing problem. Inequality has been a growing problem in Britain since the 1980s, since Thatcher. According to UNICEF, in 1995, 1 in 6 people in the UK depend on government income supports to keep them above the poverty line, which is very low, compared to 1 in 20 in Denmark. 1 in 5 UK children lived in poverty in 1995. By 2012, 1 in 4 children in the UK depended on government income to keep them above the poverty line. And the Leave campaign indirectly and implicitly connected these economic issues and economic disillusionment, with general anxieties about the existing immigration situation. They blame the EU for the ongoing migration crisis. The migration crisis of refugees fleeing Africa and the Middle East. And they blame the EU for this, even though arguably it's not the EU itself that is causing the crisis. Indeed, towards the end of the campaign, UKIP made the migration crisis the centerpiece of the EU campaign, The great irony about this, and I'll show you several slides in a second, the great irony about this is Britain, as a result of its very loose connection to the EU, it's the loosest connection of the EU to the EU of any of the states, actually had control of its borders when it comes to migrants and refugees. It's not the EU that insisted that migrants and refugees had to go to Britain. It's other international treaties that Britain had signed, like the Convention on Refugees. But that didn't stop Mr. Farage, but basically fear-mongering that the EU was forcing on Britain thousands upon thousands of migrants, refugees, all from scary places. And this is a billboard for the Leave campaign by Farage. And this is one of the pamphlets they put on in people's mailboxes. Basically, countries set to join the EU. So it seems like it's about the EU and the problems of the EU. And it points out that Turkey has been lobbying to be part of the EU for decades, no closer. And a whole bunch of countries in the Balkans here have been slated for admission into the EU. But the countries that really stand out on this map are Syria and Iraq, which are not have anything to do with the EU, but that's clearly the point, right? The fear is that these countries are close to Turkey, and the people here are going to somehow arrive in the UK. Another fear that was used by the Leave campaign was basically capitalizing on the terrorist attacks on mainland Europe in 2015 and 2016, Paris twice, of course, and Brussels in March of 2016. Within this context, those pushing a right-wing nationalist message found a ready audience amongst a sizable section of the electorate that wasn't there before. Like other European right-wing nationalists, UKIP and the backers of the Leave campaign tapped into this latent sentiment in their stoking of populism, pushing back against elites that they said were out of touch with the realities of authentic society. Tory leaders like Johnson and Gove played this populist card just like Farage did. They all recognized that a cultural values divide had opened up in Britain, as elsewhere, that while in some ways aligned with traditional class boundaries, in other ways cut across them, but are associated, I would argue, to this social status issue. I'm going to use a heuristic penned by David Goodhart. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but it's a British political commentator, which I think well describes this divide. On the one hand, you have what he calls the anywheres, people who make up perhaps 25% of British society. Although their social backgrounds vary and their economic status is variegated, anywheres tend to be highly educated, socially liberal, and are very mobile. They value openness, autonomy, and fluidity. They generally find social change easy to handle, and they have weak attachments to a particular place. This is the elite that UKIP and the populists were railing against, people like me, and I suspect people like you. On the other side, you have a less politically influential but much larger group, perhaps 50% of the population, that Goodhart labels the somewheres. This population tends to be less well educated and to be much more rooted and attached to place, and to value familiarity and security and the things you would expect that flow from those kinds of lifestyles. Somewheres find adapting to change, social change, more difficult, and tend to have more stronger group attachments, whether it is to nation or city or some other place. Goodhart notes that there are many different kinds of anywheres and somewheres, and there are some big in-between groups, but this is the big divide as he sees it. I should point out that one of the things that makes this heuristic work is a huge percentage of the British population are born, live, and die within a very small radius of the place that they're born. It's something like 10 miles or 15 kilometers. Most people in Britain are not do not move around much. They don't change cities. This is a simple heuristic without any explanatory power in itself, but I think this nomenclature has value because it describes in a simple way the cleavages that have been observed in a number of Western societies in the past 20 years and overlaps with the scholarly work about cultural identities and the importance of social status that I mentioned before. It fits, for instance, with the American sociologist Talcott Parsons. In discussing the spectrum of human identities, Parsons distinguished between ascribed and achieved identities. For those with achieved identities, their sense of themselves doesn't come from who their parents were, or where they were born, or what group they belong to. They are people who go to good colleges, have more or less successful professional careers, and they're aligned with the global knowledge economy, and their sense of themselves is portable. They can go anywhere and fit in. Their identity is not tied to anything fixed. They can fit in anywhere. But if you don't have those advantages, if your formerly secure manufacturing job has been outsourced to the developing world, you will probably fall back on an ascribed identity. That is, for example, I am a British white male. And if your identity derives from things that you perceive as unchangeable, then you are likely to be more easily discomforted by change to your group, by change to where you live. And you are more likely to be threatened by outsiders who make claims on the identities or places that you regard as yours. Far-right nationalism and those who support UKIP and the right wing of the Conservative Party drew support from somewheres and demonized the anywheres. And that is the essence of their populism. Just to give you a sense from UKIP, what we know about UKIP voters, this is from 2014, so it's before the referendum. This is a study by a couple of political scientists at the LSE. UKIP voters, overwhelmingly over the age of 50, 99% white, the vast majority have limited or no post-secondary education, most have blue-collar jobs, 81% believe immigration will undermine British culture, and 80% believe big business took advantage of ordinary people.